The funerary hush enveloped Cypress Grove Cemetery like a heavy cloak. Tall oaks stood guard among solemn gravestones, their branches swaying with a soft rustle that underscored the grief in the air. The sky was a muted gray, as if nature itself mourned Thomas Caldwell's passing. Rows of black-clad mourners clustered around the open grave, heads bowed beneath the reverend's low, trembling benediction. A few stray leaves skittered across the neatly trimmed grass, and somewhere in the distance a lone bird cried, a plaintive sound that seemed to echo in the hearts of those gathered. Friends and community acquaintances stood shoulder to shoulder, exchanging subdued greetings or offering thoughtful nods to acquaintances they recognized. Their collective grief shimmered in the hush, an unspoken bond that drew them together on this somber morning. When the pastor finally concluded, his final words lingering in the air, a woman in her early 50s quietly dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Another woman, younger, reached out to grasp her arm in silent comfort. It looked as though the crowd might disperse. Some were already taking tentative steps away from the grave. Suddenly, from the far edge of the gathering, a figure emerged. She looked to be in her 70s, maybe older, dressed in a flowing green dress that stood out against the dark attire of everyone else. Her tall frame carried an undeniable grace, and the lines on her face spoke of a life spent enduring storms. A few people noticed her, then nudged others, and soon the entire congregation had turned in curiosity. Some of the mourners frowned, uncertain if she was lost or if she'd come merely to observe from afar. But in steady strides, she moved toward the headstone, every step measured, as if each one brought her closer to a truth no one else dared voice. Her green dress rustled in the gentle breeze, the lively color underscoring the stark seriousness of her presence here. Her voice, low but firm, cut through the tension like a blade. "Before you bury Thomas Caldwell," she said, pausing just long enough to let the full weight of her words register, "there's something you all need to hear." A wave of confusion rippled through the crowd. Some bristled at the audacity of a stranger interrupting a funeral. Others leaned in, drawn by the promise of a revelation. The air felt charged, and the hush that just moments before had been solemn now took on a fragile tension. "He wasn't who you thought he was," she added, her eyes sweeping over the gathered mourners. "There's more to Thomas Caldwell's story than you know." An uneasy murmur sparked around her. Could there really be secrets about the man they had all admired, some of them for decades? The sky seemed to darken, as though in agreement with the heaviness of her claim. And so, in that moment, the funeral changed from a quiet farewell to a stage for something far more profound. A wave of whispers moved through the funeral party, soft but insistent. Who was this woman? And by what right did she speak so boldly in this sacred moment of farewell? Some people exchanged quick, nervous glances, while others tilted their heads in curiosity, hoping for answers they did not yet possess. She cleared her throat softly and lifted her chin. "My name is Hattie DeLay," she began, her voice carrying with surprising resonance in the open air. "I'm not here by accident, and I'm certainly not here to disrespect this solemn occasion." Pausing, she exhaled, as if steeling herself for the enormity of what she was about to reveal. "I know Thomas Caldwell," she said, casting a purposeful look at the casket, "better than most of you, and I need you all to understand the sacrifices he made." Skepticism flickered across several faces. A man with silver hair stepped forward, eyes narrowed, clearly protective of Thomas's memory. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "Thomas was a good man. We're all aware of that. This funeral is meant to honor him, not tarnish his name," Hattie finished for him gently, yet firmly. "I have no intention of doing that. In fact, I'm here to show you just how good he truly was, even better than most of you realize." A few uneasy murmurs surfaced in the crowd. A woman near the front glanced hesitantly at Hattie's green dress, wondering at its brightness in contrast to their own mourning black. Another whispered, "Who is she?" to a companion who only shook her head. Hattie sniffed the cool air. "I met Thomas in Montgomery, Alabama, 50 years ago," she explained, speaking slowly as if each memory required delicate handling. "Back then, it was a different world. a time when someone of my skin color was kept out of most places, especially the ones he frequented as a well-meaning school teacher. That statement roused immediate attention. Several people looked at each other, recalling that Thomas had once taught in Montgomery. But it was something he rarely mentioned. Many only knew fragments of the story. Now Hattie stood determined to fill in the gaps. It was the civil rights movement, she continued, letting her gaze rove across the crowd. And the tide was shifting in America. We were organizing sit-ins at lunch counters, kneeling in prayer outside city halls, marching across bridges where we were greeted with violence instead of understanding. I was right there in the thick of it, and so was Thomas. But he never boasted about it, never once tried to claim credit. A hush claimed the mourners again, but this time it was laced with fascination. Almost all of them had known Thomas Caldwell as an unassuming philanthropist. He donated quietly to local shelters, funded school supplies for disadvantaged kids, and offered mentorship to teenagers who struggled. Yet few had heard of his involvement in the fights for equality, let alone his direct participation in the era's most tumultuous events. Hattie's lips curved into a bittersweet smile. He lost his job for unbecoming conduct, but I can tell you the truth. That conduct was marching alongside people like me, people he believed were worthy of the same rights and dignity as anyone else. In the eyes of the powers that be, that made him a troublemaker. Sniffles began to punctuate the silence. A few in the crowd lowered their gazes, ashamed that they had remained ignorant of these monumental parts of Thomas's life. Hattie's eyes glistened with the weight of memory. I stand here not to make any of you feel guilt, but to shed light on the man you thought you knew. He believed in justice when so many turned a blind eye. And that is just the start of what he sacrificed. She cast a final glance over the group, eyes reflecting both sorrow and conviction. If Thomas Caldwell was once a simple icon to them, Hattie was determined to make them see the real man, flawed, courageous, and quietly heroic in ways they had never imagined. When Hattie paused, a breeze blew across the cemetery, shaking loose more leaves that tumbled across the grass in erratic patterns. The hush that descended now was different, less a respectful silence and more a collective bracing for what might come next. It was as though the entire crowd felt the ground shifting beneath them, their long-standing perceptions of Thomas Caldwell cracking apart with each new revelation. Her voice grew stronger, fueled by memories too potent to suppress. Thomas was never one to stand idly by, she said. When he saw injustice, he met it head-on. I recall a day in Selma, 1967. We were marching to push for voting rights, an act so simple yet fraught with danger back then. Thomas didn't just walk with us. He carried signs, helped organize the youth, and stayed vigilant in case anybody was threatened. Even the wind seemed to pause as if the world itself wanted to hear every word. That kind of involvement made him a target. One night after a protest, he returned to his apartment to find a note slipped under the door, a threat telling him to leave town or face consequences. Her brows knitted together, recalling the fear. He showed me that note, his hand trembling, but he didn't back down. He told me fear was the price of real progress, and if he cowered, nothing would change. A hush fell. A mourner with tear-streaked cheeks pressed a trembling hand to her lips. She had known Thomas as a gentle soul who would quietly slip gift cards for groceries to families in need. She had no idea that same man had once stood on the front lines of a dangerous social movement, risking far more than inconvenience for the sake of others' freedom. He was fired again, Hattie continued, a second time, from a different school. The reasons they gave were always couched in polite language: conduct unbecoming, failure to maintain professional standards. But we knew the truth. He was punished for his unwavering stance with people of color, for continuing to march and speak out, for losing himself in a cause that threatened the status quo. She looked up, scanning the faces of the mourners. Some of you might wonder why he never spoke about these struggles. Understand that Thomas Caldwell was a man who believed you didn't do good for praise or recognition. You did it because it was right. He believed the cause outweighed any personal glory. A ripple of astonishment wove through the crowd. Several nodded solemnly, as though pieces of a puzzle were finally snapping into place. It explained why Thomas had such empathy for the underprivileged, why he always reached out to those who seemed to slip through society's cracks. Hattie took a measured breath, her voice dipping into quiet sadness. He lost neighbors, friends, acquaintances. Folks distanced themselves from him, whispering that he was too radical or too involved. He wasn't wealthy back then. He barely scraped by on tutoring gigs or side jobs. Sometimes I'd catch him skipping meals to afford gas so he could drive folks to rallies. Many nights I found him exhausted, shoulders sagging under the weight of a broken system. From the front row, an older woman dabbed her eyes. She remembered Thomas during that era, only in passing, as a teacher who disappeared from Montgomery under vague circumstances. None of the details had been clear back then, and she never pursued the truth. Listening now, she felt a wave of regret for leaving the blanks unfilled all these years. Hattie's gaze settled on her, then moved gently across the crowd. Everything he endured, he did it willingly. He never asked me for anything more than a listening ear and occasional help with his activism. It was as though he saw himself less as a hero and more as just one piece in a grand tapestry of change. And that's who he remained, even long after he moved north. The wind picked up again, tossing leaves into small cyclones near the headstone. Hattie seemed almost luminous in her green dress, her words weaving a vibrant, previously unseen tapestry of Thomas Caldwell's life. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet was alive with reflection, with the trembling energy of newfound understanding. Only after a long pause did Hattie speak again, setting the stage for the revelations that would truly bind the mourners' hearts to Thomas's memory. Hattie paused, placing a hand on the gleaming coffin. It was as though she was seeking strength from Thomas himself, or perhaps offering her own silent apology that this truth was only emerging now, after his death. Mourners exchanged uncertain glances, bracing for the next chapter in a story already far more complex than they had anticipated when they arrived. "There's something more you all need to know," she said at last, her voice resonating amid the tombstones. "Thomas carried a secret most of his life. It's time we honor him by bringing it into the light." The silence was suffocating. The tension made the air feel heavier, pressing down on everyone present. A few sniffles and coughs punctuated the hush, but otherwise the crowd stood motionless, captivated by her every word. "He had a son," Hattie said simply. Disbelief rippled through the mourners. Some heads turned, scanning the cemetery for any sign of the unknown child. Others simply stared at Hattie, eyes wide. "And that son is here today." A flock of birds fluttered overhead, their cries overlapping in momentary disharmony, as though nature herself reacted to the magnitude of the statement. Hattie's gaze swept toward the rear of the crowd, beckoning silently. A tall man with broad shoulders began making his way forward. Each step he took seemed laden with both sorrow and determination. Murmurs spread like wildfire among the mourners. They looked at him, some immediately noticing how his eyes, shaped and colored, bore a striking resemblance to Thomas's. Others saw the subdued anguish etched across his face, a lifetime of carrying a truth that couldn't be voiced. The man stopped beside Hattie, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "His name is Samuel," Hattie said. "Thomas's son, a son the world never knew he had." A subdued cacophony of gasps and exclamations followed. A woman near the front, who had been a close friend of Thomas's, clasped her hand to her mouth in shock. She had never heard of any children, let alone someone who appeared to be in his 40s. Samuel cleared his throat, his voice deep and tremulous. "My father loved me," he said, as though he needed to establish that first thing above all else. "But he couldn't acknowledge me in the public eye." An undercurrent of realization swept through the crowd. They might not know the full story yet, but the very fact that Samuel stood before them, a product of a hidden relationship, hinted at a complicated truth, one likely shaped by the racial divides that were insurmountably large in Thomas's youth. Hattie gently laid a hand over Samuel's. "Thomas's son was born to a woman he loved deeply, a black woman who faced her own battles in a time when interracial relationships were more than just frowned upon. They were dangerous, sometimes deadly." The mention of that era's hostility made some in the crowd shift uneasily. Memories of segregated counters, separate water fountains, and violent confrontations came flooding back for the older attendees. Younger faces registered shock, likely realizing just how much the world had changed, and how little in some respects. But Thomas, Hattie continued, was never going to abandon that child or the woman carrying him. He supported them in every secret way he could. He wrote letters, sent money, kept track of Samuel's schooling. Whenever it was even remotely safe, he visited, sneaking over late at night or in the early dawn when fewer eyes watched. A tear slipped down Samuel's cheek, though he tried to maintain composure. He made sure I never felt unwanted, he managed. He'd slip me books, help me with questions I had about math or history. In all the ways that mattered, he was there. But he couldn't risk both their lives by making it public. The crowd stood stunned, grappling with the image of Thomas Caldwell as a clandestine caregiver, a father in the shadows. The revelation was as heartbreaking as it was illuminating. It explained his tireless dedication to marginalized communities, his empathy that extended far beyond mere philanthropy. Hattie drew a shaky breath. "He would have claimed you, Samuel," she said, turning to him. "He wanted to 1,000 times. But fear for you, for your mother, for the potential backlash, held him back." Someone in the crowd whispered, "I can't believe this," while another dabbed at tears that had begun to flow. The reactions mixed sorrow with awe. Sorrow for the heartbreak father and son endured, awe at the depth of Thomas's hidden courage. Samuel pressed his lips together, emotion cracking his steady tone. If only the world had been different. Hattie laid her hand on his arm. "But it wasn't," she replied softly, "and so he did what he could within it. He sacrificed recognition, acceptance in certain circles, and even stable employment so you would have a shot at a better life." The hush that followed felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm, thick with shattered preconceptions. Where once stood a revered community philanthropist, the crowd now saw a man who had navigated life's darkest corners, bearing burdens no one else knew. That new understanding bonded them to Thomas Caldwell, in a way that mere philanthropy never could. Hattie's gaze swept across the gathering once more. "And that's still not the end of his story. There's one last chapter you need to see." A hush of anticipation settled over the congregation as Hattie glanced at Samuel. She appeared to draw a final fortifying breath before speaking again. "This last act," she began, "is something Thomas orchestrated in the quiet days leading up to his passing. Even then, his mind was on others." The mention of Thomas's final days triggered fresh tears among some of the mourners. A younger man, who had once been one of Thomas's students, stared at the casket with reddened eyes. He recalled how Thomas tutored him patiently in math after school, never taking a dime, and how later Thomas helped him fill out college applications. It was a memory he had cherished, but now it felt like just one puzzle piece of a far grander legacy. "Thomas called me 2 months before his death," Hattie continued, the fight momentarily escaping her voice as she recalled the frailty that had begun to consume him. "He was tired, so tired, but too stubborn to let go of his final project. He told me he was setting up a trust fund." A collective intake of breath rippled through the group. If there was one thing they did know about Thomas Caldwell, it was that he was philanthropically inclined. Contributing a trust fund, however, sounded like a formal extension of the quiet giving he'd done all his life. Hattie's eyes flickered with sad pride. But this trust wasn't for himself or his immediate family. It was for children who grow up in neighborhoods where opportunities are scarce, where a single parent might work 2 or 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, and kids drop out of school because they can't see a future that looks any brighter. Samuel cleared his throat, stepping forward. "My father told me that an education is more powerful than any protest sign," he said, voice subdued but steady. "He believed knowledge broke chains that ignorance helped forge. So he created this fund to provide scholarships, after-school programs, and mentorship initiatives in the community." A small chorus of astonished gasps traveled through the mourners. They had heard of Thomas's generosity, yes, but the scope and foresight of this final plan took it to another level entirely. Hattie raised her voice slightly, emphasizing the magnitude of the gesture. "He wanted this trust to last. He wanted it to outlive every person standing here. When I asked him why not put his money towards something with his name on it, he told me, 'I'm not doing this so people remember me. I'm doing this so they don't forget the children.'" A hush swept over them, broken only by scattered sniffles and the rustling of leaves overhead. Hattie's voice grew tight. He wanted the kids who feel invisible to know there's a future waiting for them. He wanted them to see light where society so often casts shadows. An older gentleman, who had served on the planning committee for the funeral, spoke up from the side. "We had no idea," he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "Thomas never said a word. He was just the quiet man who'd show up to our volunteer days with a thermos of coffee for everyone, or slip a check into the donations without fuss." "That was Thomas," Hattie agreed, her expression tinged with a proud, aching smile. "He believed so deeply in doing the right thing that he never needed applause. Sacrifice in his eyes was simply the cost of love." Tear-streaked faces dotted the cemetery now. People remembered little moments. Thomas scraping ice off an elderly neighbor's car. Thomas leaving homemade soup on a sick friend's doorstep. All these small kindnesses now piled into a monumental testament to who he was. Their regrets mingled with awe. Regret they had not come to know him better. Awe at how thoroughly he'd lived out his convictions without seeking recognition. "His final wish," Samuel said, voice breaking a little, "was that we wouldn't let these programs fall by the wayside. He wanted all of us, anyone who has benefited from his kindness or admired his principles, to step up and keep the mission alive." A sense of solemn responsibility settled over the mourners. Some wiped tears from their cheeks, some wrapped comforting arms around each other, and others stood stiffly, grappling with the sheer power of Thomas's last act. They understood now that this funeral was more than an occasion to say goodbye. It was a call to action. Hattie turned to the engraved headstone, running her fingers over Thomas's name as though tracing the letters for comfort. "This trust is a continuation of everything he stood for: equality, opportunity, the belief that every child, no matter their background, deserves a fighting chance at success." She paused, then faced the crowd once more. "But don't think for a second this is just about money. Thomas Caldwell's greatest gift was his resolve to stand up for what's right, even if it made him an outcast or put him at risk. He poured his soul into causes larger than himself, and he never once asked for your validation." Her voice, had steady as a drum, now struck the mourners like a clarion call. "This trust is his parting gift, yes, but it's also a challenge for us all. Are we willing to do what he did? Love without boundaries, give without seeking reward, fight for people who aren't able to fight for themselves?" She let her question linger, the silence pounding in every chest like a second heartbeat. One by one, the mourners processed the enormity of Thomas's legacy. They realized with startling clarity that they stood at a crossroads. Either take up his mantle or let it fall into the earth with him. Samuel bowed his head. "He believed we would make the right choice," he murmured, "and I'd like to believe that too." It was a moment heavy with reflection, but also ignited by a sense of purpose. Thomas Caldwell had not merely lived a good life, he had laid out a roadmap for how to live with courage, generosity, and unwavering faith in human dignity. All that remained now was whether the people he left behind would follow it. A moment stretched into an eternity as the crowd stood in reverent silence. The funeral, once a routine ritual of goodbye, had transformed into a powerful reckoning with a man's hidden truths, a man's enduring love, and a man's final challenge. Hattie and Samuel remained at the forefront by the casket, unified in their determination to honor Thomas fully. Hattie turned away from the headstone, her eyes scanning the somber faces of the mourners. In them, she saw confusion, awe, respect, and a hint of guilt for not having known Thomas's full story. "All of you came here expecting to say farewell to a man you believed was kind and giving," she said, her voice resonating with a quiet certainty. And that part was true. Thomas was kind. He gave more than most of us ever will. But he also lived in the shadows, sacrificing far more than we could imagine. She paused, swallowing a lump of emotion. He carried burdens alone. He walked beside those who were ignored, persecuted, made to feel less than human. He fought battles that weren't his own, simply because he believed in justice. And even when it cost him his job, his reputation, and his safety, he pressed on. That's why we stand here now, to acknowledge the man behind the gentle smile and to promise we won't let his efforts die with him. A middle-aged mourner, tears streaking her cheeks, cleared her throat. I "I never knew," she whispered. "He was so quiet about his own struggles. I wish, I wish I could go back and thank him for everything he did." Hattie offered the woman a gentle nod. "We can't change the past, but we can honor him by living differently going forward. It's easy to speak well of the dead. It's much harder to carry a legacy of compassion and courage into our own lives." Picking up on the cue, Samuel addressed the group, his posture steady. "My father used to tell me, people will forget what you did if you did it for applause. But if you do it for love, they'll remember even if they never knew your name." That's why he didn't advertise his activism or his fatherhood or his final project. He wanted it to be about the cause, not about himself. A quiet sigh seemed to ripple through the ranks of mourners. Some offered tearful half smiles, others remained solemn. But there was a palpable shift, like a shared resolution settling in. They were no longer passive observers at a funeral, but participants in a narrative that demanded action. Hattie stepped forward, allowing her gaze to encompass them all. "Ask yourselves this: what will you do with the life you've been given? Will you stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves? Will you see beyond the surface and reach out to people in need, no matter how different they seem from you?" She turned back to the headstone, placing a trembling hand upon the smooth granite. "Thomas taught us that an act of kindness can ripple outward, touching countless lives. He taught us that love isn't about who sees it, it's about who feels it. And he taught us that the cost of doing what's right can be high, but the reward is a more just world." A sense of closure mingled with a burgeoning sense of responsibility. One by one, people began to move closer to Hattie and Samuel, offering handshakes, quiet condolences, or expressions of gratitude for sharing their memories. The hush of grief was replaced by the murmur of renewed commitment. Hattie looked once more at Thomas's name, her voice cracking at the edges. "Thank you, Thomas, for showing us that real strength often wears the face of humility. We'll carry your spirit forward." Samuel reached out and placed his hand over Hattie's. "And we'll ensure that trust you created, that last gift, fulfills its purpose, to lift up the children who, like me, might otherwise remain unseen." In that resonant moment, marked by tears and promises, regrets and hopes, the funeral drew to a close. Yet it felt more like a beginning. Thomas Caldwell's earthly life had ended, but his influence, his legacy, now rested in the hearts of those who finally saw him in all his hidden brilliance. And as they dispersed amid the towering oaks, the hush remained, filled not with sorrow but with resolve. The quiet was a promise made by every mourner standing there. They would not let Thomas's sacrifice fade into the dark. Instead, they would become the bearers of his light.